On the night of 6th of July 1988, more than 200 men were working on Piper Alpha, an oil and gas platform in the North Sea. For most of them, it was another shift offshore. The platform stood far from land, surrounded by dark water, machinery, pipework, gas lines, and steel decks. But before the night was over, Piper Alpha would be torn apart by explosions and fire. 167 people would die, and the investigation that followed would expose a chain of failures that changed offshore safety forever. This is the story of the Piper Alpha disaster. Piper Alpha was one of the major platforms in the Piper oil field, roughly 120 miles northeast of Aberdeen. It had started as an oil production platform, but over time it was also modified to handle gas. That mattered. Gas is different from oil. It can spread quickly, ignite violently, and turn a machinery fault into a platform-wide emergency in seconds. By 1988, Piper Alpha was not just one structure in the sea. It was part of a connected offshore system. Other platforms sent oil and gas through pipelines linked to it. That meant that what happened on Piper Alpha could be affected by decisions made beyond the platform itself. The disaster began with maintenance. Earlier that day, work had been carried out on one of Piper Alpha's condensate pumps. A safety valve had been removed for servicing, and the equipment was not ready to be used. In a safe system, that information should have been impossible to miss. But offshore work depends on communication. It depends on permits, it depends on shift handovers, and it depends on every person knowing which equipment is safe to restart and which equipment must stay isolated. That evening, another pump stopped working. The platform still needed to keep operating, so staff looked for another pump to bring online. The pump that had been under maintenance was restarted, but the safety valve connected to it had been removed. When the pump came back online, pressurized gas escaped. Within moments, that leak found an ignition source. The first explosion hit Piper Alpha at around 10 o'clock at night. It tore through part of the platform and started fires that spread into an environment filled with fuel, pipework, and vulnerable systems. At first, some workers may not have understood the full scale of what had happened. Offshore platforms are loud, complex places. Alarms, vibration, machinery noise, and emergency instructions can become confusing very quickly. But the situation was already moving faster than people could control. Fire damaged equipment, smoke-filled areas of the platform. Communication systems failed or became unreliable. Men tried to reach muster points, lifeboats, or safer areas, but the routes were changing minute by minute. The emergency plan depended on people gathering and waiting for instructions. But Piper Alpha was not facing a small contained incident. It was being consumed by a growing fire. Then came the pipeline problem. Piper Alpha was connected to other platforms. Even after the first explosion, fuel continued to arrive through pipelines for a critical period of time. That fed the fire. Later explosions were even more destructive. Large gas lines ruptured. Fireballs rose from the platform. Sections of the structure became impossible to reach. Heat was so intense that rescue from the sea became dangerous, and people trapped above had fewer and fewer options. Some workers jumped from the platform into the North Sea. Others tried to shelter in accommodation areas, hoping rescue would reach them. Some made it into the water and were picked up by nearby vessels. But many were trapped by smoke, fire, blocked routes, and the speed of the disaster. To understand Piper Alpha, picture the platform as a vertical industrial city. At the lower levels were pipework, production equipment, risers, and fuel lines. Above that were working decks, control areas, accommodation, and evacuation routes. When the first explosion happened, it did not only damage one piece of equipment, it damaged the system around it. Fire affected power. Power affected communication. Communication affected evacuation. Damage to pipework affected the fire, and fuel from connected pipelines made the emergency larger than the platform itself. This is why Piper Alpha became so deadly. It was not one simple mistake. It was a chain, a pump under maintenance, a removed safety valve, a shift handover failure, a restart decision, a gas leak, an ignition, a platform layout that made escape difficult, connected pipelines that continued feeding the fire, and emergency systems that could not keep up with the speed of the disaster. The men on Piper Alpha were not just fighting flames. They were fighting a whole industrial environment as it failed around them. Rescue crews and nearby vessels responded, but the conditions were extreme. Fire lit up the sea. Smoke and heat made approach dangerous. Helicopters and boats faced a platform that was still exploding and collapsing. The disaster continued through the night. By the time the main fires were brought under control, Piper Alpha was a ruin. 167 people had lost their lives. Only 61 survived. The scale of the disaster shocked the offshore industry and the public. The inquiry that followed was led by Lord Cullen. It examined not only the immediate events, but the safety culture behind them. The findings were severe. The permit-to-work system had failed. Communication during maintenance and handover had failed. Emergency planning had failed to match the real risks on the platform. And the wider offshore safety system needed fundamental change. The Cullen Inquiry made 106 recommendations. They transformed offshore regulation in the United Kingdom. Responsibility for offshore safety moved away from the Department of Energy and toward the Health and Safety Executive. Operators were required to take a more systematic approach to identifying hazards, reducing risk, and proving that their installations could be operated safely. Piper Alpha became a warning that high-risk industries cannot depend on assumptions. A missing permit can matter, a handover can matter, a valve can matter, a delayed shutdown can matter. And when those small failures connect inside a complex system, the result can be catastrophic. The men who died on Piper Alpha were workers at the center of an industrial system that failed them. The lesson of the disaster is not simply that offshore platforms are dangerous. The lesson is that danger has to be managed before the emergency begins. Because once gas escapes, once ignition happens, once fire reaches the pipework, and once evacuation routes disappear, the time to build a safer system has already passed. Piper Alpha was destroyed in one night. But the changes that followed reshaped offshore safety for decades. This was dead reckoning.